हेलो एवरीवन, मेरा आपसे एक बहुत ही सिंपल क्वेश्चन है। आपकी स्क्रीन पे एक ग्राफ है, उस ग्राफ पे दो लाइनें हैं। एक लाइन अपवर्ड स्लोपिंग है, तो उसे हम मान सकते हैं कि एक इंट्रिंसिक वैल्यू लाइन है या फेयर वैल्यू है। किसी भी एसेट की एक फेयर वैल्यू होती है, ये लाइन उस फेयर वैल्यू को डिनोट कर रही है। द सेकेंड लाइन विच इज द कर्व लाइन इज द मार्केट वैल्यू लाइन, मीनिंग किसी भी पॉइंट पे रिलेटिव टू द फेयर वैल्यू आप किस प्राइस पे इस एसेट को खरीद या बेच सकते हैं। राइट नाउ मेरा सवाल आपसे ये है कि अगर आज हम पॉइंट ए पे हैं फॉर एग्जांपल, तो क्या आप इस एसेट में एग्रेसिवली इन्वेस्ट करना चाहेंगे, ज्यादा पैसा इन्वेस्ट करना चाहेंगे या फिर कम? क्वेश्चन नंबर 1। क्वेश्चन नंबर 2 इज, अगर आज हम पॉइंट सी पे हैं तो आप ज्यादा एग्रेसिवली इन्वेस्ट करेंगे, ज्यादा पैसा इन्वेस्ट करेंगे या फिर कम? राइट नाउ मेरे पास एक और क्वेश्चन है, द थर्ड क्वेश्चन है। इन दिस क्वेश्चन आई वांट टू रेज द बार अ लिटिल बिट, बट बिफोर आई डू दैट आई हैव अ वेरी सिंपल रिक्वेस्ट, which is that if you like anything about this video, please feel free to click the like button and please consider subscribing, because for a new channel, छोटे चैनल के लिए जैसे मेरा चैनल है, every single subscriber is very motivating and it helps me to continue working hard, right? With that, let's come back to question number 3, which is that if we are at point P today, new graph, would you be more aggressive or would you be more defensive? And the fact is that it's not so easy to answer this question anymore. In fact, point A pe bhi easy nahi tha. It's just that we can see A to C, the graph is moving up. So a lot of us thought that we will be aggressive. From C, we thought we will be defensive क्योंकि नीचे आ रहा था. But in reality, in real life, it's not so easy to answer this question. So according to Howard Marks, one of the most successful investors in the world, right? In his book, Mastering the Market Cycle, he suggests कि if we have a better understanding of the market cycles, right? The tendencies of the market, we will be able to position our portfolios better so that we can benefit from these movements, right? And that's exactly what we will try to learn in this video. So we'll break the video down into two parts, right? Part number 1 mein we'll understand the major types of cycles and then all those different types of cycles that make up the market cycle. And second part mein we'll actually apply those lessons in the Indian context, especially on Nifty 50. So keep watching. So the base layer is the economic cycle, and the performance of an economy is measured in terms of GDP, gross domestic product, which is nothing but the sum value or the total value of all goods sold and services provided within a country in 1 year. And fundamentally, GDP is a function of the number of working population, the number of hours worked, and the productivity. And any changes within these major factors will result in, usually long-term changes in the GDP cycle as well. And on top of that, the GDP cycle is a combination of two types of cycles, the short term and the long term. The graph on the left that you can see is kind of maybe representative of a country like India, jahan pe the long-term GDP cycle is in an uptrend, and around that, of course, we have short-term, booms and busts and that kind of thing. On the right-hand side, the graph may be representative of countries such as, maybe UK, maybe Greece, जहाँ पे जो structurally long-term GDP जो uptrend है, it has reversed. It is either going sideways or it is declining, right? So both these factors, the long-term and the short-term, they both play together, and a combination is what makes up the GDP cycle, right? But the most important feature of the economic cycle या GDP cycle is its stability. अभी आपके सामने ये जो ग्राफ दिख रहा होगा, right? So you can see from the graph that literally in the last 60 odd years or something, jo the period of this graph, there have only been 3 instances jahan pe GDP was actually negative compared to last year, jahan pe GDP decreased from compared to the last year. And of course, during that time there have been periods of above 5% growth, 7% growth, and even below 5%. But you can see the relative stability, right? 10% से ज़्यादा कहीं भी नहीं है, and negative almost 3 times in 60 years. So it's a very, very stable cycle, and that's why it is the base layer. Now, if we compare the GDP cycle with the corporate profit cycle, right? So how are corporate profits moving along with the GDP? It's a very interesting graph. And my question to you is, just to make things more interesting, is what do you think? आपको क्या लगता है? Will corporate profits be more volatile? Will they vary more than the GDP or less? And I think it's no surprise if you look at this graph. This is for Nifty 50 EPS, earnings per share data, so profit data, over the last, I believe, since 2000. And we can see that, of course, it is far more volatile than the GDP itself. We had that period of 2003 to 2007 where, the growth was, way higher than historically or has ever been. And then, of course, since 2010-11, we have literally been in a very slow growth as far as the corporate profitability is concerned, right? And finally, in the last 1-2 years, we are again seeing a rapid increase in the profitability. So maybe the corporate profit cycle is kind of reversing, right? But what are the factors that impact the corporate profits, right? So what are those factors? Let's understand in the next section. So we know that corporate profitability varies a lot, and it depends on a bunch of macro factors and micro factors. अब ये काफी complex हो सकते हैं, but if we were to simplify one factor on the macro level and one factor on the micro level, we can say that macro level पे the impact of GDP on particular sectors, I think, is the biggest reason, because depending on whether we are in an uptrend, अगर economic boom चल रहा है, or we're going through a bad period such as a recession, the sales of certain sectors will vary a lot, right? For example, अगर industrial raw materials की बात करें तो economic uptrend में इन raw materials की demand काफ़ी बढ़ जाती है, right? So obviously this sector will do well, right, in an economic uptrend, and do pretty poorly in an economic downtrend या recession, right? So industrial raw materials क्या होते हैं? जैसे for example oil हो गया, crude oil and related products, steel हो गया, commodities हो गई, rubber हो गया. So all of these industrial raw materials are impacted, are very responsive to the economic cycle. If you look at sectors such as food या फिर medicine, they are not so much impacted by the GDP cycle, right? If you look at big ticket durable items, जैसे housing हो गया या cars हो गई, they are obviously very responsive, क्योंकि depending on where we are in the cycle, हमारी salaries अगर बढ़ रही हैं, सब कुछ अच्छा चल रहा है, we tend to spend more, right? At the same time, if you look at low ticket sort of daily kind of use products या फिर items या services, so let's say newspaper subscription हो गई, आपका Disney Hotstar का subscription हो गया, आपका haircuts हो गए. So all of these little things we don't really change much, depending on कि अच्छा time चल रहा है या not so अच्छा चल रहा है. So these are the reasons why corporate profitability can be impacted on a macro level. अगर and by the way, one big indication, one let's say a quantitative, a number that can tell us whether profitability of corporates is in an up cycle or down cycle relative to the GDP, तो मेरे ख्याल से corporate profits to GDP का जो ratio है, I think that is a very useful measure. And on your screen now, I think you can see the graph, and we can see that for a long time, almost पिछले 10 साल, 2010 से 2020 तक, we were going through a very poor period as far as the corporate profit cycle is concerned. But now again, I think last 1-2 years, we're seeing a big uptick, right? So that's on the macro level. On a micro level, operating or financial leverage are the biggest reasons why sales or profitability का जो difference है. So let's try and understand that. Let's say आपकी एक juice की दुकान है, and during normal months जो है, sale is around, let's say 75,000 rupees. You have 50,000 of fixed cost, and assume करते हैं इस बिजनेस में कोई वेरिएबल कॉस्ट नहीं, मतलब जैसे जैसे सेल्स बढ़ेगी आपका और कोई कॉस्ट नहीं बढ़ेगा, सिर्फ फिक्स कॉस्ट है. सो नॉर्मल महीने में अगर आप 75 का सेल्स है और आपका जो फिक्स्ड कॉस्ट है 50,000 है, सो यू मेकिंग अराउंड 25,000 रुपीज़ एज प्रॉफिट। बट लेट्स से गर्मियों के महीने में फुटफॉल आपका बढ़ जाता है, पीपल आर मोर थर्स्टी, यू नो, एंड उस रीज़न की वजह से आपकी सेल इंक्रीजेस फ्रॉम 75,000 रुपीज़ टू लेट्स से 100,000 या 1 लाख रुपए। बट बिकॉज आपके फिक्स कॉस्ट सेम है, 50,000 का 50,000 ही है, योर प्रॉफिटेबिलिटी actually has gone up from 50,000 to 1 lakh rupees. So for a roughly 33% increase in your sales, your profit has actually increased by 100%, right? So this phenomena is called operating leverage, and financial leverage is also similar, where because of the interest payment you have to make, जो आपने लोन ले रखा है उसकी वजह से क्या डिफरेंस आता है सेल और प्रॉफिट के बीच में. So that's what financial leverage is. But by and large, these are the factors that impact corporate profitability on a macro level and on a micro level. Now, in the third major cycle we want to understand is the credit cycle, right? So let's move on to that. The credit cycle is much harder for retail investors to observe and track in their daily life because it impacts companies a lot more than individuals. And we should think of availability of credit like a window, like a credit window. जब ये window खुली होती है, companies can borrow money, continue functioning normally. And when this window shuts down, it can cause a lot of problems, right? So there are three critical reasons why this credit window needs to remain open. पहला है कि obviously you need capital, you need money to invest in assets. Factory खरीदनी है, पैसा चाहिए. You want to invest in machinery, you need money to expand and grow. Also, companies need working capital, right? Even to maintain their daily functioning. So if the credit window shuts down, it can cause a lot of problems, and some financially indisciplined companies can even in extreme cases go bankrupt. Right? The second reason is that the way companies finance their expansion sometimes is that they will borrow short term, because short term, जैसे 2 साल का लोन जो है या 1 साल का जो लोन है, the borrowing cost is a lot lower versus 4-5 year loan, right? And they will use this short term money to invest in assets that will pay back over 4-5 years or a longer term. So होता क्या है कि जब when things are great, this is not a problem because हर 2 साल the company can again refinance the debt, right? उसे repay करके और ले लेते हैं. So the whole cycle keeps on functioning normally. But when the credit window shuts down, all of a sudden, companies cannot refinance their growth. And like I said, weaker companies can actually, get into a lot of trouble. In fact, ये जो mismatch की problem है, right, this asset liability mismatch in the case of finance companies is exactly what exposed the DHFL or IL&FS का जो crisis है, इसी की वजह से expose हुआ था. The third reason is that banks and NBFCs themselves borrow and lend to each other. So जैसे credit window shut होती है, usually it shuts because there is some sort of fear, there is some sort of uncertainty in the environment. So obviously lenders become very scared or at least risk averse, and they become very selective कि किसको हम पैसा देंगे किसको नहीं, right? And this is a whole cycle, right? So because finance companies themselves are not lending to each other, they're not willing to lend as openly to companies, this can actually cause a lot of contraction generally in the economy as well. And in extreme cases, it can actually cause a recession. In fact, the 2008 का US recession था, that did not start in the economy necessarily. It started with the banking sector. And even the 2018 crisis जो इंडिया में हुआ था because of this, IL&FS and DHFL, this again caused an overall slowdown in the system. And as you can see from the graph in front of you, ये जब IL&FS और DHFL crisis kind of happened, so you can see that the loan growth slowly kind of tapered down. उससे पहले we were seeing a lot of growth in the overall loan growth in the system, but it really kind of started to decline after this crisis unfolded. And if we look at the GDP numbers also, 2019 was not a great number. So it's not that एक cycle, only the economy will impact the other cycles unidirectionally, but they all combine, they all interact with each other. And when it comes to the credit cycle, I think it can actually cause a lot of issues. And according to Howard Marks in his book, he says this is the most underappreciated cycle, simply because काफ़ी मुश्किल हो जाता है retail investors के लिए इसको track करना. The fourth and final cycle we'll discuss is the cycle in investor psychology, and I think investor psychology is the most volatile, the most fickle kind of cycle. And it is also the greatest source of profits if used correctly. Howard Marks अपनी book में ऐसा कहते हैं कि we should think of investor psychology like a pendulum which swings between extremes, right? So it swings between greed and fear, between panic to sell and FOMO, urgency to buy. It swings between undervaluation and overvaluation. It swings between demanding, value in the present to saying कि ठीक है 3 साल बाद भी मिल जाए तो चलेगा, right? So these are the usual extremes between which this pendulum swings. And also, as Warren Buffett has a very beautiful quote on how we can kind of think about investor psychology and use it to profit. So the quote goes, be fearful when others are greedy and be greedy when others are fearful, which basically means कि जब सारे बेच रहे हो, when everybody is rushing, everybody is panicking, we should try and buy. And when everybody is being greedy, everybody is trying to buy, we should try and sell, right? So that's the investor psychology cycle. Now, in summary, what we can say is that the GDP cycle या economic cycle सबसे ज़्यादा stable होती है. It does not fluctuate a lot, right? Corporate profit cycle जो है, which is the second cycle we discussed, is a little bit more volatile than the GDP. The credit window cycle is even more volatile, and सबसे ज़्यादा volatile होता है या सबसे ज़्यादा fluctuate जो करता है, it is the investor psychology, right? So now the question is, how can we use this understanding, right, of these 4 different cycles and figure out कि आज stock market में क्या चल रहा है? How can we apply this framework to, let's say, the market today, to, let's say, Nifty 50? हमें 2 चीज़ें चेक करनी चाहिए according to Howard Marks. उन्होंने कहा है कि we should check for A, some quantitative factors and B, qualitative factors. Quantitative में we basically need to check कि valuations किधर हैं historical standards के हिसाब से. And in terms of qualitative analysis, we need to look at the investor psychology. So पहले quantitative देख लेते हैं. In front of you, there's a graph, and this shows basically P ratio and Nifty index. अब काफ़ी लोग conclude करेंगे क्योंकि आज P ratio is roughly around 20-21, which is in the median range. A lot of people would conclude that because of that markets are somewhere around fairly valued. But what you are missing if you are thinking like that is that April 2021 से जो NSE है उसने अपने इंडेक्स कैलकुलेशन में प्राइस जो अर्निंग है P रेशो, प्राइस बाय अर्निंग रेशो, उसमें अर्निंग्स पहले क्या होता था, सिर्फ स्टैंड अलोन कंपनी की अर्निंग्स इंक्लूड होती थी. बट नाउ दे स्टार्टेड एडिंग कंसोलिडेटेड अर्निंग्स, मीनिंग सब्सिडरीज के का जो प्रॉफिट है, जो अर्निंग्स है, वो भी ऐड हो रहा है, जिसकी वजह से पी रेशो हैज़ गॉन डाउन. सो विद इन 1 डे, आई थिंक April 1st को P ratio reduced from 40 to 33, right? So basically now it's almost impossible to compare the current P ratio with historical P ratios, and therefore just on that basis, I think it's very hard to say कि markets are fairly valued, right? So what do we do now? इस केस में we need to look a little bit deeper into the earnings cycle, जिसकी हम already थोड़ी बहुत बात कर सकते हैं, कर चुके हैं in the corporate profit cycle में, right? So earning cycle को अगर चेक करना है, so again let's have a look at the Nifty 50 का जो EPS है उसका ग्राफ आपके सामने दिख रहा होगा, and we can see year on year growth. अगर आप देखें तो 2022 में there's a sharp increase. Now obviously जैसे हमने डिस्कस किया, a part of that increase has come from adding consolidated earnings, but there are also other factors that can help us understand that in fact corporate earnings जो cycle है, it is a kind of on the uptrend. And उसका एक काफ़ी बड़ा अगर quantitatively check करना है तो we can check another ratio जो हम already देख चुके हैं, which is corporate profits as a percentage of GDP. Even that is the highest in the last 10-12 years if I'm not wrong, right? So that is again another hint. And on top of that, there are also some kind of qualitative reason जिसका ग्राफ मैं आपको नहीं दिखा पा रहा हूँ, but basically what has happened is कि banking sector has gone through a rough 7 years. एंड लास्ट 1-1.5 साल में बैंकिंग सेक्टर के जो एनपीए रेशियोज हैं दे आर एट द लोएस्ट एंड देयर प्रॉफिटेबिलिटी हैज़ इंक्रीज्ड एंड द रीज़न व्हाई दिस इज सो इम्पॉर्टेंट इज बिकॉज banking sector accounts for nearly 35% of the Nifty 50 index, right? So it's a big chunk. तो उसकी banking sector की earnings improve होने की वजह से overall जो earning cycle है that is also going positive. Secondly, the price wars in telecom sector have finally kind of coming to an end now. And telecom companies are धीरे increasing their rates and their profitability will also follow suit, right? Telecom again accounts for, if I'm not wrong, 10 to 15% of the index. तो आप देख सकते हैं कि nearly 50% of the index जो companies हैं या जो sectors हैं निफ्टी इंडेक्स में they are seeing an increase in their earnings. So I think there's a lot of evidence that profit साइकिल जो है कॉर्पोरेट्स की और स्पेसिफिकली इस केस में निफ्टी 50 की दे आर काइंड ऑफ ऑन एन अप ट्रेंड, सो थिंग्स आर लाइकली टू इंक्रीज. नाउ ऑफ कोर्स देर आर रिस्क्स एंड नोबडी नोज फॉर श्योर कि क्या हो सकता है. वी आर ओनली टॉकिंग बेस्ड ऑन द लाइकलीहुड या चांसेस या प्रोबेबिलिटी, राइट? सो द रिस्क्स आर ऑब्वियसली देयर. वी हैव इन्फ्लेशन इज द बिगेस्ट रिस्क. आरबीआई इज इंक्रीजिंग इंटरेस्ट रेट्स. तो उस इंक्रीज्ड इंटरेस्ट रेट्स का किस टाइम तक इकोनॉमी पे इम्पैक्ट आता है, किस डिग्री तक इम्पैक्ट आता है, it is hard to say right now, but those are the obvious risk. We have energy prices are at an all-time high or close to all-time highs, so that's the risk. Now if we look at the qualitative reasons, Howard Marks suggests उन्होंने एक checklist दी है that you can check, you can sort of look at to figure out कि qualitatively investor psychology कहाँ है. And I think ये checklist जो है काफ़ी investors के लिए थोड़ा सा मुश्किल हो सकता है आंसर करना, because it's a binary thing कि या तो ये है या तो वो है. Usually things are somewhere in the middle. I have tried it, I'm showing it on the screen, but my sense qualitatively in terms of investor psychology is that things are cautiously optimistic. So investors are cautiously optimistic, and we know that because the IPO frenzy जो कि maybe last year we were seeing, so that has kind of fizzled out. जो new age startups जो list हुए थे, a lot of the valuations from them has fizzled out. A lot of money has kind of because US में interest rates have increased, so a lot of money has kind of left India. So all of those factors की वजह से I think investors are a little bit more cautious, but I think they are more on the optimistic side, right? In conclusion, I would say that अगर आप price to earning ratio को देखें, so PE ratio equals to price divided by earnings, which means price equals to earnings into the PE ratio. मीनिंग प्राइस जो है किसी भी एसेट का, वेदर इट्स अ निफ्टी 50 इंडेक्स हमारे केस में या फिर कोई भी स्टॉक, इज डिपेंडेंट ऑन दीज टू फैक्टर्स. एक अर्निंग्स हो गया, पी रेशियो. पी रेशियो इज बेसिकली द सेंटिमेंट. अभी ऐसा सिचुएशन है, इज माई हम्बल ओपिनियन, आई कुड बी रॉन्ग, बट आई बिलीव दैट द सेंटिमेंट इज मोर ऑन द हायर साइड, right? So there's not much upside left in terms of sentiment, right? So much of the increase is going to come from earnings. So as earnings increase, we are going to see, the index going higher and higher, right? So that's basically the overall analysis, and that's how we can try to conclude, use the learnings from this book and apply it on Nifty 50. Hopefully this has been helpful. If you like this video, please consider clicking on the like button. Please share it with people. Please leave comments if there are any questions in your mind, and please don't forget to subscribe. Thank you so much.